Well, it is my great honor and privilege to be able to introduce our speaker to you tonight. Peter Eisenman is a longtime friend of the School of Architecture. His affiliation with the school, with many of the faculty, go back as much as 30 years. Over those years, Peter has come by Syracuse for lectures, studio reviews, symposia, and most importantly, for football games. For some reason that I can't quite fathom, he has an odd fealty to Rutgers, and so tomorrow you will find him in the Dome in the futile hope that he might actually see that team win. I will be there myself to collect the bet that I have with him on the outcome of that game.
You didn't tell me I should bring my hat.
Go Orange. Seriously, among all the lecturers who have come to Syracuse in recent years, the one who certainly needs no introduction is Peter Eisenman. Now in the 5th decade of his architectural and intellectual production, Peter has secured his place in history as one of the most prodigious of builders, thinkers, writers, and teachers of architecture. The range of his work, from small houses in Connecticut to a stadium, an NFL stadium in Arizona, is nothing less than astonishing. His theoretical wanderings have been equally broad, taking him from Frankl to Foucault, with parallel excursions into language, semiotics, and now I understand film. His teaching has taken him from the University of Cambridge to the Cooper Union, with various periods at Ohio State, at Princeton, at Harvard. He is currently the Louis I. Kahn Visiting Professor of Architecture at Yale. In 1967, Peter founded the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York City, an architectural think tank and clearinghouse he directed for 15 years. While there, he also served as the founding editor of Oppositions, probably one of the most important and influential journals of its time. Peter has authored several books, including Codex, Diagram, Diaries, Blurred Zones, and one of my favorite titles, Eisenmanual, to name just a few. His numerous articles have been collected into 2 volumes entitled Written into the Void and Eisenman Inside Out. In 2003, Monticelli Press issued the long-anticipated Giuseppe Tiragni, Transformations, Decompositions, Critiques. And most recently, Rizzoli published 10 Canonical Buildings, which examines significant projects from 10 architects between 1950 and 2000. Peter is the principal of Peter Eisenman Architects in New York City. Among Eisenman's many award-winning projects are the Memorial for Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, the Wexner Center for the Visual Arts at Ohio State, and Koizumi Sangyo Corporation Headquarters building in Tokyo, which received a National Honor Award for design from the American Institute of Architects. The firm's Aronoff Center for Design and Art, the University of Phoenix Stadium, and the City of Culture of Galicia complex in Santiago de Compostela, which is under construction at the moment, have all been the subject of television documentaries. Peter is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2001, he received the Medal of Honor from New York State chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and the Smithsonian Institution's Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in Architecture. Popular Science magazine named Peter one of the top 5 innovators of 2006 for the Arizona Cardinals Stadium. Peter holds degrees from Cornell University, from Cambridge, and from Columbia. If you're not familiar with Cornell, it's that school down the road.
Yeah, what about the one from here?
It's just a few
the
miles
one from
down
here.
The road, by that lake.
Hey, I have a degree from here.
And he has a degree from
What, doesn't count?
I'm kidding.
Hey.
Please, at whatever level we can get it.
Yeah. Jesus.
He has a degree from Cornell University, that school that somehow thinks that it's number 1. We know who is number 1.
Never changes.
He holds honorary doctorates from the University of Illinois, Pratt Institute in New York, and Syracuse University. In 2003, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of architecture by the Università La Sapienza in Rome. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in the context of all of this extraordinary activity, Peter always takes time to talk to students. Evidence of this was the brown bag lunch that we had recently in New York City at Peter's office. Over the course of about 2 hours, Peter talked about his work, his life as an architect, writer, teacher, and husband. It was a remarkably personal encounter, and I know that our students were deeply grateful for the time and the insights that Peter provided them. And so, on behalf of the school, I would like to thank Peter for all the time and insights he has provided us here over the past 30 years. Thank you, Peter. Please join me in welcoming Peter Eisenman.
Thanks, Randall. Is this on? Can you hear him? That's cool. I get that for tomorrow. Okay. Just a quick note. I'm going to sit down because Colin Rowe, my mentor, said that over 70 you could sit down and lecture. So I'm over 70 and I'm going to sit down. I don't know what happens when you hit 80. You hit lie down. I have one request that we put away pencils and paper. It's very distracting to me. I'd rather have you go to sleep. If I see you writing or playing with a computer or twittering or anything, I'll stop. It is most annoying. You came. I don't know why you came on a Friday afternoon. You don't want to take notes. There's a lot of other things to do around here. I would never have come on a Friday afternoon to hear anybody when I was at Cornell, so thank you. What Randall neglected to tell you is that I pulled him out of a swamp once in life, and Randall seems to forget that. The swamp was the streets of New York, and he was a biker and had a big Great Dane dog and, was in a lot of trouble in the world. And the dean at Cooper Union said, could you do me a favor and take him off my hands, take him up to your office and see what you can do with the guy. And I think Randall was allowed to spend 2 years there and get credit at Cooper. And that's how he got a degree, as I remember. But used to fly an airplane too. Maybe he still does. We got rid of the bike. We got rid of the Great Dane. He got married, had a kid, settled down. It's what happens when you come to work for me. I mean, you sober up. But I really thank you, Randall, for the introduction. And you neglected to tell these people that you walked into this bet this summer. I mean, you insisted we bet $100 on Syracuse and Rutgers. And I said, what are you, nuts? And so anyway, I only want Rutgers to win tomorrow to collect the 100. I mean, because the way the office is going, you need it these days. Anyway, thank you for this. This is partial payment. Anyway, I want to be a little bit serious because I do teach and I do think about practicing architecture. And so I have some notes that I have prepared. I'm working on a book called The Architecture of the Disaster. It, for me, is an important statement about where the world is today and how architecture relates to it. And the lecture tonight comes out. I'm trying to get this book out of the way. So there are 6 chapters, and this is the 4th chapter of the book. And I want to sort of work through it with partially reading it, and then it'll take about a half an hour. And then I'm going to show some slides of a, for me, quite a large project in Spain. 6 buildings, that 4 of which will be finished next year. 2 are finished now, 2 next year, and 2 in about 3 years. But it is something that every architect would like to do. That is to, in a sense, design one's own context, rather than dropping a building into a context or dropping a building into a greenfield situation. Designing 6 buildings to create a context is something that is a very important project. Equally, the project I'm going to show you is about the subject of my talk tonight. So I'm going to begin. I hope it's not too serious. You get pics. I mean, every architect's supposed to show pictures, so I'm going to do that. But I'm also a teacher. I take my teaching quite seriously, as Randall said. I would like to think that I have, I think, 2 achievements that I could brag about tonight. One is that I'm the longest continuous teaching, practicing anybody else, either in this room or anywhere else in the world, that's an architect practice. My second achievement, which I know not that that's a great achievement, but I'm very proud of it, at least among architects. So I know a lot of other people went to 3 football games, and none of them were high school games, so I'm not allowed to watch high school games, even though that I sneak them in from time to time. Anyway, the title of the talk is The End of Crises, with an added parenthesis, the concept. For many, present global economic has conjured up ideas of crisis. The crisis of late capital, the crisis of democracy, the crisis of the environment, space. Now, Colin Rowe, again referring to my former teacher and colleague, used to say that one of the problems with architectural thought was that it saw itself in a state of perpetual crisis. Always focusing on the latest problem or issue, architecture was said to obey a crisis mentality, an attitude partly fueled by a nostalgia for an impossible avant-garde, and partly by the received notion that architecture was actually about solving problems. But also would have said, permanent crisis is no crisis at all. Now, for several other historians in the same sense as Colin Rowe, crisis is part of a historical cycle. Crisis signals the end of a continuity or historical development, inaugurating rather unbridgeable historical ruptures, jumps, illogics. And of course, that's what I want to talk about, where I think we were looking at history in some way, so that it's not really a crisis, but an inevitable condition, a moment of change. In his book, Crisis, by the philosopher Massimo Cacciari, he suggests that a crucial change has taken place in modernity, that is, the former epistem that we operated under, and that capitalism is involved in crisis within its tropes. That is, a necessary part of capital is the idea of crisis. A rupture, he argues, is a crisis of foundations, which signals the end of classical rationality, also the end of dialectics in philosophy. And of course, for me, the real issue is are we really coming to the end of the dialectical condition, which is part of what I think the crisis is about. He suggests that a crisis of dialectical synthesis, in fact, underlays the development of the modern period. For Cacciari, the crisis was in parallel with the belated continuation of modernist principles. That is, after the Second World War, when modernism had thought to fail, modernism continued in its various garbs, as we all know. He says that crisis, disaster, and lateness also all point to a questioning of what will be called here the metaphysical project. And it is the dialectics of the metaphysical project that I think architecture has responded to and is realizing it part of. And what the architecture of disaster is about is the unrecognized condition that metaphysics plays in the understanding of architecture. In another interpretation of crisis, Manfredo Tafuri saw the idea of crisis as something productive. He considered history also as a project of crisis, in that historical work or criticism seeks to confront the boundaries, assumptions, and conventions of history. In other words, for Tafuri, the work of history is of necessity oppositional. In this sense, criticism and crisis are linked etymologically. And as Tafuri suggests in his book, The Sphere and the Labyrinth, it can be argued that the root of critical activity is to call something into crisis. He says, historical work calls into question the problem of the limit. It projects the crisis of techniques that are already given. The real problem today is how to project a criticism capable of putting itself into crisis by putting into crisis the real. And I think that is the real issue. Can criticism put itself into a critical context in itself? Another term that I want to use tonight, different from the term crisis as spoken about by Rowe and Tafuri and Cacciari, three of the giants of the 50 years at the end of the 20th century, is the term lateness. Lateness is different from crisis in many respects. It is here understood to be primarily outside of an opposition to a persisting condition, but against also Tafuri and Cacciari's understanding. Against Rowe's idea of perpetual crisis, that there is no crisis at all, this idea of lateness is no longer oppositional or dialectical. Now, there's a man by the name of Edward Said, a philosopher who died a few years ago, proposed an idea of lateness as what he called a late style. And in this book on late style, he elaborated its characteristics and strategies. Said attempted to define lateness as two subtly different but related aspects. First, lateness can manifest a transgression, let's say, of the tendencies characteristic in an artist's own oeuvre or of a moment in time in general. In other words, that there are these two issues. For example, Said says about Beethoven's late work that they reject a clear narrative of his own, Beethoven's, artistic canon into which the artist finds himself placed. But on some deeper level, Said said, there is a dissonance and an eccentricity in Beethoven's late work which is no longer overtly oppositional, i.e. dialectical, or about communicating ideas, but rather expresses an ambivalence toward the idea of communication itself. And I think this is important. This idea, because we are in an era of communication, all of you carrying cell phones and what have you, instant communication and information seems to be the rule of the day. This idea of late work, therefore, is not about instant information or communication, but rather concerns the impossibility for an architecture of such previously known communication, whether it's music, literature, philosophy, etc. Said suggests that this indecipherability, the lack of communication, may be one of the characteristics of a period of lateness, which importantly questions the purpose of communication itself. Thus, a necessary change in how we communicate will be seen to play a role in lateness. Now, there's no question that the forms of communication that we knew 20 years ago are not the same that inhabit this room today. So that as communication, the means of communication has changed, and what is communicated, which seems 90% of the time trivial, also the idea of communication is also, in a sense, trivialized. There is a second aspect of lateness which can be understood as non-oppositional and non-dialectical, that is, outside of the metaphysical project, as an inwardly oriented disciplinary critique. In other words, not only is it a moment in time in the historical cycle, or a moment in time in someone's career, i.e., I am in a late moment in my career. I am also, I believe, in a late moment in the historical cycle, but I'm also interested as an idea of lateness as an inwardly oriented disciplinary critique. In other words, to look into architecture and see again what its possibilities are, not looking forward as the idea of the projective, but looking backward, but looking into. In forming his idea of lateness, Said also refers to Theodor Adorno's discussion of a book called Spätstil, which also talks about Beethoven's late work. For example, Adorno suggests that Beethoven's late work cannot be read in the same manner as other Beethoven work, that Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, for example, written at the end of his career, was the composer's response to the seeming impossibility of innovation. And I think we are beginning to wonder about innovation and the possibility of the new. And in fact, in a Spanish newspaper this week, there was a headline which quoting me saying, "I am totally against the possibility of the new." And of course, it's a very strong statement and a very strong headline. And of course, I would like to explain what that means tonight. Instead, Beethoven wrote a piece that was difficult, even anarchic, and could not be easily understood because it was outside of his characteristic style. Adorno thus describes late style as a moment also in culture before a shift to a new paradigm, a moment that contains something that cannot be understood at its time, but also holds implications, perhaps, for a possible future. Said cites Adorno and Beethoven's late work as examples of the complexity, ambivalence, and in the Derridian terms, Jacques Derrida's sense, undecidability that characterizes late style. And in this sense, lateness is a turning away from time as a narrative, as a continuing condition. It's turning away from a dialectic, and it's therefore turning away from the metaphysical project. Thus, late style is not seen as a new idiom in an artist's work, one that reflects an artist's maturity, not as harmony and resolution, but rather as intransigence, difficulty, and unresolved contradiction. And I think that what we will see tonight in the project I'm going to show you, all of these conditions perhaps pertain. Lateness, then, has two overarching aspects. First is a belatedness, which challenges or transgresses the status quo of its time, so that rather than thinking of itself as a zeitgeist phenomenon, that is, to be in the present, integrating something outside of its place and time in the present. And so therefore it is anti-zeitgeist. It is also, in other terms, anti-genius loci, that is, understanding something of the place, so that it doesn't evolve out of place or in time, but out of time and in a different idea of place. In Said's terms, late works quarrel with time. Neither a nostalgic nor cliched use of the past, this belatedness reflects a sense of being out of time and outside of time. In other words, it is against any historicizing or zeitgeist notion. This aspect of lateness is unintentionally contained in Jacques Derrida's idea of, his famous idea of this double. Oh, I did it. That's all right, but I can't read. A French word which combines two words, the French word différence, which is both different from something else and a deferral or late in regards to its own historical condition. So différence is different from what went on before, but is also a deferral or late in regards to what is perceived to be the moment of the present. The second aspect of lateness described by Said, which involves an inwardly directed critique, does not therefore present an overt challenge to its time. It is this non-oppositional aspect of lateness which will be seen to be critical in the context of what I want to show tonight. Now, there have been periods of time where this non-dialectical aspect is taught, it can be seen. And I want to refer to the Italian Renaissance for one of them, where for the first moments of time, the metaphysical project became basically an avant-garde project, and that was with the architects like Brunelleschi and Alberti. That would be the avant-garde moment of time. The second period of the High Renaissance would include Bramante's establishment of the autonomy of the organism as a part-to-whole system. The third period of the High Renaissance would be the Mannerist period, which was revolting against the orthodoxy. And this is the way the cycles usually go. But there is, more importantly, a fourth tendency, or a moment that follows, that can only be characterized as one of lateness. Before, it's neither Mannerist nor Proto-Baroque. And this can be seen in the architects such as Vincenzo Scamozzi and Sansovino. And in fact, Manfredo Tafuri talks about Sansovino's work as having a condition of what he calls sprezzatura. Now, sprezzatura is an idea that, in fact, is characteristic of lateness. It is an idea of calculated carelessness. In other words, it is a subtle misuse of codes. And it seems to be unconcerned with what the rules of the codes are. That is, in reality, very concerned. Sprezzatura is an idea involved as a maximum of naturalness with a maximum of artifice. Sprezzatura implies a context of norms that are known and from which certain rules may be broken, not in an obvious way, but in a laconic, almost accidental or hardly noticeable way, as if the break were an oversight. We have a similar moment today, I think. If we look at modernism and we see the avant-garde period from 1914, let's say, to 1939, with the outbreak of the Second World War, and in a sense the end of the avant-garde. And then we see the period from 1945 to 1968 as the moment where modernism was accepted by capital, especially in this country, as an idea that identified what was new, what was energetic, and what was something that survived the horrors of war, and would be called the high period of modernism. 68 and the student revolutions and books like Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction and Aldo Rossi's Architecture of the City would involve, let's say, the third period, that is the Mannerist critique of high modernism. And one could even say that the deconstruction exhibition at MoMA in 1988 brought an end, which was a critical show involving Rem Koolhaas, Bernard Tschumi, Frank Gehry, Danny Libeskind, and others, an end to the postmodernist critique. So for 1988, and here we are in 2009, almost 2010, 20 years later, this and the expected new paradigm brought about by computation and the digital revolution really never materialized. We use them as tools, but they haven't produced a condition of what I would call either paradigmatic change or epistemic shift. In other words, there's been nothing new happening in the socio-political world, or there have been a lot of new things happening, but they haven't necessarily been reflected in a new architecture. And if I were to describe the architecture of today and those things that we see on students' desks, what are the books we see? Well, when I was growing up, we had Œuvre Complète by Le Corbusier, which was the sort of Bible of the time. But what we see on students' desks are books by the most rococo of modern architecture, that is, things that are happening in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. Parametrics and algorithms which produce, an infinite variation with no meaning at all, and they're begging the question of how one chooses. So I think that there probably is coming a condition that is changing, and a paradigm shift may be happening. And that is, I would argue, the independent idea of late capital. That is, no longer can a country or a part of the world suspend itself in a kind of and survive, because our currency is not only linked to the euro, it's linked to the Chinese currency. The Chinese currency is linked to other currencies. And of course, we have India sitting there waiting to become a new market and a new global power. The thing that has changed is, one, that global capital is no longer an autonomous system decided upon in a hierarchical structure from Wall Street or Washington. And number two, there is a political system linked to religious systems, and that is fundamentalism. And fundamentalism, while it's been an active spirit in the world and especially in the United States, has taken on a rather problematic situation. And we find ourselves in situations like Iraq and Iran, I mean, not Iran, but Afghanistan, and we say to ourselves, what are we there for? How do we get out? Can it ever end? And of course, one of the great problems is that if you leave the Taliban take over, it becomes a home for terrorism. But if you stay, what are you achieving? And so what we're finding, like the British found in 1918, when they went into the tribal conditions in the Middle East and started bombing the tribes in Iraq and Iran, by the way, very similar to our bombing in Afghanistan, is that what we create are political institutions that have nothing to do with the social values and organizations of the constituencies that we're dealing with. And so it might just be that fundamentalism is spawning a condition, a different epistemic organization of the political. The minute the political and the economic begin to shift, and there's a new theoretical value which hasn't been given since Marx and Keynes and others, and is there another social organization that hasn't been given, let's say, since Foucault and Freud, we might have an epistemic shift, which might then relate in some way to the possibility of an architecture. I think for me, Paul de Man describes it in the best way possible using a linguistic analogy. And he says that traditionally societies evolve their rhetoric out of a grammar. That first, in any society, the understanding of what the rule structures are and how one speaks in those rule structures precedes what these rule structures can become to mean. And he says that clearly in schools, in the first year, we teach grammar, you know, how to make a plan, how to make a section, how to make an elevation, what is the best way to site a building, to enter a building, all the grammatical rules that have been handed down to us from classical times. We don't know why we still do this. We don't know why and what these things mean to people in our contemporary world. But what de Man says, and very specifically in an essay called Semiology and Rhetoric, is that fundamentalism may have changed the rules of the game, in that, in fact, fundamentalism is essentially a rhetorical political structure that has little respect for the grammatical rules of political organization. And that perhaps we are in a situation where rhetoric defines the grammar. And of course, if we look at that and say, what does that mean for architecture? It means big time. It means that we have to look at what are the rhetorical devices that architects can use, and how, in fact, can they invent a grammar for their use. And there have been moments in time when these things happen. The rhetoric of the French Revolution invented a new grammar in Boulez and Ledoux and in neoclassicism. And the rhetoric of modernism, of Towards an Architecture by Le Corbusier, or The Spirit of the Age by Mies van der Rohe, invented a new grammar, the grammar of the 5 points, the 4 compositions by Le Corbusier, invented a grammar with which to express this rhetoric. Now, if we analyze the situation just in historical terms, we get an interesting time period. If we take Ledoux and these people to be around 1820 and 1830, some 30 or 40 years after the French Revolution, or 50 years after the French Revolution. And we take Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe as positing these new grammars out of a new rhetoric. We find that they are about 1910, 1920, somewhere 90, 80, 90, 100 years apart. And we also see that there hasn't been anything new in architecture for 50 or 60 years since, in a sense, the modernist revolution, or since the Great War, which could be akin to the French Revolution. So my argument is we're around 2010. That is 80, 90, 100 years after Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe first prospected, let's say, their new grammars, that maybe there is a new rhetoric that is involved, and I'm suggesting that there possibly is, which might suggest to us the formulation of a new grammar. And the issue is, for me, that how one finds a new grammar is to turn inward into the discipline and find out how that possibility occurred, whether it was in the time of Ledoux or the time of Le Corbusier. And so therefore, I want to argue about something that's very positive. I want to say, in fact, that while it's late for me, and it may be late for architecture, it's very early for all of you. That in fact, we are not in a condition of crisis. You may not be able to get a job today, but that lasts for a day and another day. I was through a crisis supposedly in 1970. I was in 1982 in my office. There's supposedly a crisis in 2008. We're all still here. So those crises are not really crises, but they are, in a sense, a condition of lateness. And I think lateness, for all of you who are really early, the idea of crisis, that it is not crisis provoking, that it does not critique, as it were, what has preceded us, is really important. And this is not the time, but in fact for you, like Zaha Hadid and Rem Koolhaas, etc., they ain't avant-garde, they're late, okay? And that's the interesting thing. If you look at them as then you see the world in a different situation. And this is a moment of time that is conducive to looking at the possibility of grammar and grammatical strategies that evolve out of the rhetoric of today. That is neither a new paradigm nor an opposition to an old paradigm, rather, but a unique opportunity to examine the possibility of what I call grammar, you can call it syntax, you call it whatever you want, as one of the major unthought conditions which exists in perhaps the end of truly of an episteme, and that is the metaphysics of presence. Jacques Derrida once said that architecture was the locus of the metaphysics of presence. It was the metaphysical project par excellence. And what I think is that we need to question that statement. We need to ask if, in fact, that is true. And I think that what we will find out is, if we look at some of the conditions that have been put forward by people like de Man and Derrida and Lacan and Deleuze and others, and Guy Debord, we will find that one of the interesting things for architecture is that, or that comes out of the significant studies, is there is no one-to-one correspondence between a sign and a thing. And that one-to-one correspondence between something and that sign has always been the fundamental condition of metaphysics. If we can take that away, we begin to see the signs we make and the things we make in a very different way. And the idea that the sign and the thing, that the meaning and its object do not necessarily have to be what I call synthetic, is the beginning of that questioning. With that in mind, I want to show some pictures of the Santiago project that we are working on. One of my students, people like to sort of tweak their teachers. I mean, well, basically, you know, you're an analytic architecture build. I said, well, you know, I don't know if I really build in this. Many of you, this is going to show. Every 3 weeks. Steel construction. I look of architecture, my teaching, and I think you can't ask the question, what does it mean? Because I know what it means. I know it's big, and I know that so interesting about it. We started it. It was called a city of. We started it for one government in Spain. 4 years later, and no one realizes that the political process, of course, this is one of the interesting things about architecture, the political process is not in sync with the architectural process. We've been working 10 years on this. All right? The first government said we want it to be X, right? The second government comes along and says, well, we don't want to change the forms since all governments are supposed to be functional. We certainly can't afford to change the forms. We just want to change the functions, right? And bid the project on these redone interiors. We call an opera house now a work because social placed the right wingers who wanted an opera house in a country where a part of the place for experimental theater and people to learn how to sing and dance and run around, right? And then the right wing up again. So not only that I'm talking about, but it's the practice of that theoretical condition. These people are also undecidable. They don't know what they want or why they should want or why they should be spending $800 And build us this. Found out, so I don't want to equate myself with, you know, I just follow what I'm told to do. But sometimes architects without a great company, we don't have people that will go there, we don't have anybody to sustain it. And they said, Mr. Eisenman, you just build us an opera house. I remember just before I get to lighten up the situation, when I went to see him, and you know, for this art department, or this a library, or this or that, we need 40 offices. You know, I added them up. I said, we need 40 offices. All we have are 15 little offices. What are we going to do with the people? And the vice president for finance, the most powerful Ohio State at the time, and a very big university, looked at Peter, if you ever say that outside of this room about this building, I'm going to fire you. So shut up and build 15 offices. And that's what we did. Here, I ain't so sure. Anyway, I think the football team may be better, but sorry. I wasn't trying to get a job here. Let's go with some picks. We can turn the. This is. Here it is. State construction. This started out as a newspaper library. It changed into an archive building for everything but newspapers. And I don't know what it is now. Maybe it'll turn into a museum. This is a library building for 1 million volumes. The Minister of Culture said, I want a library for 1 million volumes. I think they have 150 to 200,000 volumes. We have shelves for 1 million volumes. I don't know what they're going to do with the rest of the space. This is the Opera House, which is under construction. There is a museum planned in this area here. Of course, in the meantime, they built a museum downtown. They said, well, why do we need this museum? I said, I don't think you really do need this museum. So this may become a multiplex or whatever, but we haven't redesigned it yet because we haven't reprogrammed it 4 years after the administration changed. This is another museum, and this is a research building. To show you the size of this auditorium is a 12,000 seat auditorium. It's not the size of the Carrier Dome, but it's pretty large. So we have approximately 1,700,000 square feet under cover, which is sizable. The first project, this was a model, we made it. It was an idea of carving away a hillside. But the real strategy was this. We were in a higher stakes competition against Rem and Danny Libeskind and Jean Nouvel and Ricardo Bofill and Stephen Hall and on and on. There were 10 architects, and we knew they all could make better objects than we could, so we decided not to make an object, but to make, as it were, to figure the ground, to erupt the ground. And this was the